Hello everyone, thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Black Stories Matter. My name is Sarah Madison. I'm the Director of the Australian Centre, host of the Critical Public Conversations series. Before we do anything else, I'd like to introduce the wonderful Auntie Di Kerr, who is going to give us all a very warm welcome on this very, very cold day in Naarm. Auntie Di.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Auntie Di. That was a wonderful, wonderful welcome. Wurundjeri elders have kept us grounded as we've moved to this online world over the last couple of years, keep us connected to country, and we honour and respect your custodianship and your care for this beautiful place. So thank you very much for being a part of today's webinar.
Thank you.
Before I introduce our speakers today, I just will go through a couple of little housekeeping issues. So we have disabled the chat function for today, but we would like to hear from you through the Q&A function. So please type in any questions that you have. You can do that anytime during today's presentation. And when our speakers today have finished, we'll have some time for them to answer some of those questions. If there are technical questions, someone on the Australian Centre team will deal with those quickly as well. So please get typing in the Q&A function if you've got questions for today's speakers. I'm now going to introduce our wonderful speakers today. So today's presentation is Black Stories Matter, the Media, Power and Aboriginal Aspirations. And we have Professor Heidi Norman, who is a leading Australian researcher in the field of Australian political history. She has made significant contributions to understanding of Aboriginal social, cultural, economic and political history, where she addresses questions of power in relation to Aboriginal citizens, the state and settler society, and Aboriginal land justice. She is the Associate Dean Indigenous in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Technology, Sydney, and is a descendant of the Gomeroi people from northwestern New South Wales. Joining Professor Norman is Dr. Archie Thomas, who is a Research Fellow in the Social and Political Sciences program at the University of Technology, Sydney. In 2021, they completed a 6-month postdoctoral fellowship at the Australian National University's Centre for Aboriginal Economic Policy Research, and their research focuses on institutions and social change, education and power, discourses and media representations, and Indigenous and settler relations. So, welcome. Thank you very much, Heidi and Archie, for joining us. I'm going to hand over to you and disappear.
I'll just start by thanking Auntie Di for her wonderful welcome to Wurundjeri country, and to acknowledge that myself and Heidi are both here today on Gadigal land where we live and work. So acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. And I'd also like to thank the Australia Centre for having us today. So can you see the slides up at the moment? I can't see them. There we go. Excellent. Thank you. And I'll get you just to switch over to the next slide, Ellie. So today we're going to be talking about our work, which examined the important role that public discourse plays in the important role of Indigenous and settler governance. And so myself, Professor Norman, Andrew Jakubowicz, and a host of other researchers, including journalist Amy Maguire, Alison Whitaker, Lorena Allam, and Anne-Marie Payne, developed a major study looking at 45 years of news media reporting on major events in Aboriginal political history. And quite relevant for our discussion today and generally is that we wanted to look really at moments where issues of self-determination, questions of treaties and agreements between Indigenous nations and government were negotiated, where Indigenous groups put demands forward. And we want to talk about some of those findings today in a particularly interesting context. Of course, the Black Lives Matter movement, kind of called the media out in different ways and started to open up a whole lot of conversations about what we call in our book, the dominant white standpoint of Australian media. And also in the post-election environment, which Heidi will talk to a little bit in a moment. So our research started, I'll get you to switch to the next slide, Ellie, from the understanding that the way that the media tells stories matters. Of course, reporting isn't solely responsible for policy outcomes, but is influential in kind of shaping the ways that we know and understand Aboriginal politics and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And, the ways that we understand that are shaped by kind of long-standing signifiers and framings that reappear in kind of shifting and changed forms, but that have also been regularly challenged. So if we think, for example, about the kind of deficit discourses is a common one, which, kind of compare Indigenous people to a non-Indigenous standard and often focus on kind of lack and correction. It is a common way of sort of knowing and understanding Indigenous people that has clear negative effects. So the media in particularly, one of the ways that they exercise their power is giving the impression that they are merely expressing public feeling, whereas they're also in the process of shaping public feeling. And, there's a long connection between the Australian media as an institution and the kind of centres of settler power, which really sort of speaks to the theme of the series. The series, and I'll get you just to switch to click. Yeah, excellent. So you can see here the methods and the ideas that kind of motivated the research that we undertook, which looks at the way that the media plays a central role in generating damaging or potentially positively enabling discourses about Aboriginal aspirations for change, for self-determination, for treaties and agreements. I'll hand it over at this point to Heidi. Okay, I'll get you actually to switch to the next slide. Ellie, to slide 4. Okay. Wonderful. Okay. We're having a couple of technical difficulties here, so I'll just speak to this next slide and then I'll hand over to Heidi. So our research was published in 2020, and since that moment, the importance of this work has been, amplified. We're in a particularly kind of pertinent time right now, a moment of kind of potential shift and optimism. The new government, of course, Anthony Albanese's first promise as the new Prime Minister was the full implementation of the Uluru Statement of the Heart. That could potentially involve a referendum to amend the Constitution. And at the same time, there's, of course, treaty negotiations in Victoria. The Northern Territory and Queensland are at different stages of treaty negotiations, Victoria's being the most advanced. It's certainly not the first time that Aboriginal people have demanded constitutional change and recognition. And we looked at several of these instances in our study. And at this point, I'll just hand over to Heidi to discuss that point, and I'll get you to switch over to the next slide, Ellie.
Can I just check that you can see me okay? I've just shuffled around. Is that
great.
okay? You can see
That's
me
great.
okay?
Thanks, Heidi. Yeah.
Thank you. Apologies, everyone. Okay, so here is the story. Archie has provided an overview of this work that we worked on. A book. The title of the book is "Does the Media Fail Aboriginal Political Aspirations?" And as you saw from that earlier slide, and as this slide shows to an extent, we looked at 45 years of news media reporting of particular key moments in Aboriginal political campaigns. So we started in the 1970s with the Larakia petition, and we wrapped up with the Uluru Statement in 2017. So that took us to those 45 years. And what is significant, this is what Archie alluded to a moment ago, is that in this work, it was funded by New South Wales Aboriginal Affairs. And I want to highlight that because when Ani Dai in our acknowledged country welcomed us to her country, she was saying something she had a few things to say. And we've looked on to Victoria, many of the things that are happening in Victoria, I think, the Truth and Justice Commission, the treaty conversations, the settlement discussions in light of that have been in place for a number of years in light of the dreadful decision of Yordi Order that's now has a 20-year history. And what New South Wales Aboriginal Affairs wanted to challenge in funding us to do this work is the question of what is the role of the media in reproducing the dynamics that have led to the inability to progress beyond this constant procrastination on the part of government, but also over time, as we've looked, we start to map out these key political movements. So, Aboriginal affairs these days, it has a history. It has a modern history. So I'm not talking about thousands of years. I'm talking about, the last 50, 60 years of these really detailed provocations of the settler state, of settler society, of the settler state. And this is certainly where constitutional recognition is a key dimension. And what we argued, and this is what New South Wales Aboriginal Affairs was wanting to pose, is, in terms of constitutional recognition, the fundamental question is, what is the relationship, what is the rightful place of Indigenous peoples or First Peoples within the life of the nation? And for Aboriginal Affairs in New South Wales as a government department, what they were saying is, if the intention here is about sharing power, is about self-determination, then how is that possible to imagine that level of significant redistribution of power and the sharing of power on the part of government? And so one area that sometimes is scrutinised, but not enough, is the role of the media in the sort of stories the media tell about our worlds, and how that in turn shapes policy debates, it shapes public interest, it shapes how people want to vote. And this is a really critical issue as we go into what is now likely to be, we anticipate a referendum sometime next year. So the role of the media comes into really critical focus yet again. So how the media tells stories of Aboriginal or First Peoples political aspirations is, as we have argued in our work, is really central to achieving change. So what did we find? I'm going to talk, I've probably gone over my time already, but let me come to the chapter I wrote in the book. I wrote 2 chapters, and one chapter that, as I mentioned, that concluded the study was the 2017 Uluru Statement from the Heart. So we go to the next slide. In about 2 or 3 minutes, I'm going to raise some key points about this. Now, you can see here what we are very familiar with now. We can probably recite elements of the text. We can probably look for the signatures of friends and family. And this image it's familiar to us. It's kind of ingrained. This is a really powerful moment back in May of 2017. So there has been a lot of commentary after this particular event, but I want to take us back to this moment. And that's because, in a sense, that's what there has been a lot of commentary, of course, around the Uluru Statement from the Heart. What I want to pick up is how the media, right, in inverted, scare quotes, how the media reported on this particular event. I can't do full justice to this, but of course, it is much more elaborated in the chapter. There's a couple of key points I want to highlight. So why is it useful to think about how the media reports on this event and other significant events? Well, one is that if the media, notwithstanding that, when we say the media, what do we mean? Well, in this case, I'll narrow it down to the news print media. But generally, we're talking about how stories are told in the public sphere, in the public domain. So the media is part of that. But let's think about a couple of things. One is that the Uluru Statement from the Heart, it was, as I have argued, a tactical intervention in that public discourse. So how stories of Aboriginal worlds are told in the media, in the public realm. Why and how? What do I mean by that? So, think about the convention being held in the Red Centre. So again, it's already builds up a sense of there's place. There's you think about that being in the centre, the heart of the nation. But think about that as a political tactic also, in that it was relatively isolated. It meant that the journalists who came and participated for the first time, a lot of these journalists, they were in an all Aboriginal world, reporting on an all Aboriginal process of dialogue. This is, unless you go to an event like the Aboriginal Rugby League Knockout in New South Wales or other forums, very rarely are you in such an embedded and deeply surrounded Aboriginal world. So here were journalists who would have been well and truly, for the most part, most of the journalists, outside of their lived reality. And so how they reported on this event, I have argued, shaped that very issues of space, of locality, of contacts, of the very immersion of journalists. The other thing is that, we think about the sophistication of the Aboriginal polity. This event was held on the anniversary of the referendum. So it was imbued with the momentum of change that has a now 50-year genealogy, if you like. It has a big story, and it's a powerful story. The very connecting of that one big change to the Constitution with another proposed big, change to the law, but also a cultural shift that this statement calls for, brings to mind the politics of procrastination, the politics of possibility, and the ambition of the unfinished business. So I've got 1 minute left, and I wanted to just touch on a few other quick points. So when we looked at all of our case studies, we spotted a pretty alarming trend. And one is that it was, in most of these cases, there is not an Aboriginal readership assumed. So journalists are generally not Aboriginal. They write to a non-Aboriginal audience. All of the reporting on Aboriginal affairs leading up until 2007 that we looked at was authored by, there were no Aboriginal journalists reporting on these issues. So that's over a 45-year period. I don't have time to elaborate our methodology there, but we can share that with you if you're interested. So here is, there's what we argued is a white standpoint, and we identified 4 dominant narratives. And in the case of this Uluru Statement from the Heart, what we picked up is this irreconciliation narrative. And that sounds like it could be good, could be bad. But what we want to highlight is that a key point is that in reporting about the Uluru Statement from the Heart, on one hand, the Australian came out of the blocks very early and condemned the process as representing something that challenges and contests the settler sovereignty, the sovereignty of the state. And in a way, the Uluru Statement from the Heart prefigured that critique and responded to it. The second is this irreconciliation narrative, and that is that it's this idea that you're not going away, but you're not going anywhere. So it's a kind of stasis, if you like. So for example, there was coverage of people like, important to many of us here in Sydney, Aunty Norma Ingram, who was interviewed and saying, in a biographical, rich and generous account of her life, her contribution, saying here's someone who was involved in the 67 referendum and she's still here in 2017. So there's this kind of stasis, and it's an irreconciliation, because in one way, on one hand, you're not going away, but on the other, your aspirations, your political aspirations are not being responded to. So I'll finish up there and hand it back to Archie. We will be more than happy to share some of this work and share some of the rationale that underpins thinking about the role of news media reporting in particular as critical to advancing more robust and more substantial reckoning with Aboriginal worlds.
Okay, can you see me? I'll get you to skip forward 2 slides for me, Ellie. Thank you. Excellent. So I wanted to go back, thanks so much for that, Heidi. I want to go back a little bit in time to the first case study we look at. So we're talking about the two bookends of our study today. Heidi's the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the Larakia petition, which I examined. And there's some interesting kind of commonalities in the kind of themes and the sort of genealogy of the discourses that emerge, across this 45-year period that we examined. Some of you might have heard, about the Larakia petition, but I'll tell you a little bit about it. You'll see that on the front cover of the book there's two people holding an enormous document. That's a 3.3 metre petition that the Larakia people of Darwin, the traditional owners of Darwin, organised to send to Princess Margaret, who was visiting Darwin at the time. They got signatures from all across the Northern Territory, from figures, including the Queensland Black Panther Party, who apparently signed, quite reluctantly. When you look at it, you can see, kind of names from groups all across the Northern Territory, Western Australia, South Australia, even New South Wales. And so these signatures, some of them, thumbprints for people, that weren't able to write, demanding a treaty. And actually the Larakia people might have been the first group to demand a treaty between different Aboriginal groups in the Australian government when they sent a petition a year earlier to the Australian government. They received a response from Prime Minister William McMahon, who said it's not appropriate to negotiate with British subjects as though they are foreign powers. So you might see that is a kind of familiar refrain that we've seen when you hear about kind of ideas about the third chamber of parliament and so on, kind of recalling these familiar discourses. That rejection of that first petition compelled the Larakia mob to go more directly to the then head of state, the Queen, via her relative, Princess Margaret. So they attempted to deliver the petition when she was visiting. I'll get you to skip forward to the next slide, Ellie. It was a enormous kind of very theatrical protest that they held. So they, set up a zone for the protest called Aboriginal Government House outside Parliament, perhaps named after its, Canberra counterpart, which was, influential at that particular time. And there was large numbers of people, potentially around 200 or so, that gathered. The attempt to deliver the petition was, a bit of a melee. The petition was ripped in the process of, people rushing forward to the car that held Princess Margaret and her partner, Lord Snowdon. And the petition was ripped in the process. But eventually the petition actually landed on the desk. And I'll get you to skip forward to the next slide. The petition eventually landed on the desk of the new Aboriginal Affairs Minister under the subsequent Whitlam government, and eventually ended up, contributing to the move towards the Northern Territory Land Rights Act and the Woodward Royal Commission. This, quite impressive protest, the huge numbers of signatures that were gathered at the time, by people who are largely living in, kind of makeshift homes outside of town, things like this. The very impressive protest that they engaged in was largely declared a failure by the media, who was, as you can see from this slide, much more concerned with things like what the royals were wearing, eating, doing. We even learned things like who cut their hair, and there's a kind of recollection in the Australian, for example, by the reporter Janet Hawley, who appeared a few times in our study, an article she wrote called "How the Royals Won Friends and Influenced People." She says in the piece, "We mingled with the royal pair like old friends. We ate steak and drank scotch with Princess Margaret and schooners of champagne with Renee, the French hairdresser." I'm reminded here of the commentary about election night dinners with journalists and political candidates this election. So we can see some common sort of themes. So I find here that there's a narrative that emerges through the media coverage of the Larakia petition, which speaks to the sort of wider framework underpinning media coverage of Aboriginal and settler relations and Aboriginal attempts to pursue self-determination, pursue treaties and agreements. So while we see the royals as this kind of peaceful and noble group of people, who enjoy this luxury, have a legitimate place in society, we find that they're largely the story. This is the group that needs to be reported on. The Aboriginal people who showed up to protest are seen as kind of pitiable and with demands that aren't to be taken seriously, despite the fact, as I showed, the NT land rights movement was, particularly powerful and had a great impact, and has had an immense impact on land holdings in Australia. And since that point, it was only really the Northern Territory News that kind of picked up on some of that. And, you know, there's some sort of overt racism and dismissal and some of that of the Larakia mob as well in the reporting. Some of that we might not see repeated in later reportage, but we certainly see it repeated, you know, in opinion and columns. And I'll get you to switch forward to the next slide. Now, I think in terms of time, we're probably heading towards the end there. And in a moment, I'll switch over to Heidi. But you can see across the two case studies that we talked about today, both the Larakia petition of 1972, the Uluru Statement from the Heart in 2017, we find different narratives underpin the coverage. But in the end, both of them end up underpinning what we've called this politics of procrastination. The idea that Aboriginal demands for change are either, you know, pitiable, definitely not going to succeed, or potentially unable to succeed, you know, because of the racism of the Australian populace, or, you know, the difficulty of these kinds of reforms. And so we see that similar sort of politics of procrastination expressed in different ways. And we also see that the media reports from a white standpoint and assumes a white audience. I'll get you to switch forward to the next slide. Yep, and click on that so we can see the major narratives. And I think there's a quote. Yeah, excellent. I'll get you to stay there. So we open the lecture today on a note of hope for change, of, you know, political discussions about treaties and truth-telling, of Black Lives Matter's kind of challenge to systemic racism, and particularly the racism of the media. And I think the moment that we're in at the moment, the possibility of the referendum, which Heidi canvassed, will be a test, you know, of the conservative legacy media. How much have they changed? But also potentially how much do they matter? As mentioned, we look mostly at newsprint media as kind of an institution which has lost, you know, some, but not all of its influence as we've sort of moved into the social media era, which has enabled two different possibilities, you know, both an avenue for kind of racist and derogatory commentary, you know, providing oxygen for some of the most offensive ideas, but has also given space to alternative narratives, to the growth of alternative Black journalism, you know, to Black Twitter, a whole number of things that kind of challenge dominant political narratives and don't kind of let the sort of major narratives go unchallenged that we see in the conservative legacy media. So we'll wrap it up there, I think. Excellent. And I'll just so you can see both Heidi and I now. Thanks everyone for putting up with some of the technical difficulties that we had today. I hope that sort of came across clearly. Is there anything that you wanted to add before we finished up?
Only just I guess one brief sort of reflection is that, you know, we looked at 45 years of news media coverage of key political events, and we found that, you know, instinctively there's an optimism, and you would think that over 45 years what we would see is an improving, some sort of way of measuring the improvement in how the news media covers Aboriginal political aspirations. But in actual fact, it was much more uneven than that. And generally speaking, it was, you know, we came to some pretty pessimistic conclusions. And so there is a real challenge there. And I think this is what has been identified. If we are going to make the big sort of structural changes, say the sharing of power, say in the policy realm, some recognition of forms of sovereignty, then what emerges, I think, if we look at the newsprint media of these events, is that there aren't ways to tell that story. And that's the kind of conclusion I guess we arrived at, is that you know, there's a pattern of over many years, many generations of persistent, dignified provocations, protests, petitions, and, you know, there's a change of tactics. So if we think about the Uluru Statement from the Heart as a tactic, it was delivered to the people, rather than, say, the, you know, head of government or the Crown, as in the case study that Archie just introduced us to. So we can see that there have been, since we published this work in 2020, it was already on the cusp of big change. Think about, say, the number of Indigenous journalists working in mainstream, even in, say, the Sydney Morning Herald, where we are in Sydney, external funding that supports Indigenous journalists making quite significant interventions. And there's also, of course, new media. So all of these media forms that we look like are in drastic terminal decline. So there's new media and new ways there's new forums for these sort of public debates to take place. So I think, we've got a lot of things to carefully think about, and there probably is some optimism there that we can draw upon.
Wonderful. Thank you both very much for that. And thanks for you two for enduring those technical challenges at your end. I know from bitter experience how stressful that is when the wheels fall off at the last moment, but you rallied like absolute pros. So thank you so much for that. And that was crystal clear in the end. I actually would like to start the questions by picking up on that last point, Heidi. I'm interested, I remember back when I lived and worked in New South Wales, various interventions into sort of trying to train journalists, trying to, teach journalists to be less racist or to report on Indigenous affairs in a less paternalistic way. And in your sum up there, you sort of mentioned that there were periods of sort of ebb and flow. Do you have a sense of what drives those moments where the media appears to be improving, and or what causes those moments of regress or backsliding?
So, yeah, I think there's one example. So we identified 4 narratives over this 45-year period. One narrative is sovereignty, and that appears once. And there's a bit of irony, there is some irony here that where we identified that narrative was in relation to the Treaty Committee. So the Treaty Committee was a group of European Australians who came together concerned to advance Aboriginal rights. And they came together in 1979. I just need to double check that. Yes, so the Treaty Committee, what was really interesting is that that was the first and only example in our case study where a sovereignty narrative becomes much more prominent in the media coverage. And I think one of the reasons there is that you have really influential European Australians, non-Aboriginal Australians. So you've got people like Bill Stanner, other famous women poets, many others whose names I just can't, they're not coming to me right this minute. But here we have like the sort of cultural elites, really decent people who have already they've got cultural capital. So they're speaking about, say, their role in environmental movements. And then while they're there, they talk about Aboriginal sovereignty. So here by 1979, of course, there was enormous disappointment with the expectations that arose during the Whitlam government's era and of self-determination, recognition of land rights. So here were a lot of people who'd been involved in those movements for change, who had close and intimate, relations with those leading Aboriginal intellectuals at the time and activists. And they start to advance an agenda for sovereignty that says, in order for things to change, there has to be much more substantial institutional transformation. And so that idea of sovereignty emerges then, and it's led by European Australians. And in part because they have a lot of cultural capital. They have connections with journalists. Some journalists are part of the Treaty Committee. So they're kind of activists, but within the with deep connections and contacts. So that's one example.
Yeah, interesting. A related question that's come in on the chat asks a similar question, but whether you discerned any pattern across the period that you studied of differences in media reporting based on which party was in government.
Yeah, I think that is the case. But one thing I would say, and this is probably singing to the choir, if that's the saying, is that the Australian newspaper, the Murdoch press in particular, emerges as a key voice, a key discourse in responding to Aboriginal political aspirations. So John Howard, of course, is a key figure in marking out, say, the bifurcation between practical and substantial, practical and symbolic reconciliation. So once you have those sort of, that language available to, and is picked up by the Australian, then there is really clear and articulate ways to negate most advances in the Aboriginal political rights discourse. So the Australian newspaper, the Murdoch press in particular, it won't come as a surprise, but when you look at it in the way we did in this very standardized methodology over a 45-year period, it is really striking what the Australian does to shape the public policy discourse.
Which is so interesting, because for a long time, you know, the Australian has also been, I think before the advent of a lot of the more recent black media, the Australian was often had more word count content in terms of their coverage of Indigenous affairs than any other media outlet in Australia. And so a lot of people would use it as the kind of go-to source, when clearly it was perpetuating particular and is perpetuating particular political agendas. Yeah, and that's not likely to change. So let's come back to this question of black media and the kind of social media point, because, you know, clearly the rise of Indigenous X has been quite transformative. The deliberate platforming of black voices by black people has, I think, really transformed the media landscape. I wonder if there's a sense in your study of how widespread the audience for that is that black media communicating mostly to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, or do you have a sense, this might have been beyond the scope of your study, do you have a sense of whether that is having an impact on the wider media or on the wider public?
I'm going to hand this over to Archie, because it is, in a sense, beyond the scope of this particular study that we completed. But Archie has done some work subsequent to this study that I think is really useful to share.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we didn't look at it in the study so much, but one thing we do in the book with most of the events is compare the coverage in the mainstream media to coverage in Indigenous media, predominantly looking at the Courier Mail as a very consistent, you know, print source that's available. And honestly, it's an immense, valuable archive of Aboriginal activity and protest and things like that. It's because a lot of the time it was just the place where you could get the story straight, you know, in terms of what actually happened, rather than the sort of smoke and mirrors, you know, discussion of parliamentary fracas and things like that you got elsewhere. You know, if you want to understand what actually happened in, say, the native title debate, for example, and the legislation that followed, you can read about it and try to understand it by reading the Courier Mail, but you wouldn't actually understand the context of what was really going on by, say, reading the Sydney Morning Herald. So that was something that we found. In terms of readership, we couldn't speak to that necessarily. But I have been working on a few different things at the moment, but one of those includes looking at and working with Indigenous media and Indigenous journalists working in mainstream media about how they're working to shift you know, kind of political discourses and media reporting. And so, you know, when you ask that question as well about how did things change over time, I mean, one of the key actors in that is consistently Black journalists at mainstream media institutions, and there's far too few of them, you know, but there's really a handful of people who worked very hard at major institutions like the ABC, more recently at Fairfax and things like that, to shift editorial policies and so on, and kind of do things in the background behind the scenes around that. Very exhausting work that has you know, paid off on occasion. In terms of audience, I mean, our work doesn't really look at that or measure that, but what we do try to look at is like the way that discourse is shifting and changing. And we certainly did find Heidi's work on the Uluru Statement, that the Aboriginal polity, Aboriginal organisations, Aboriginal activists are looking beyond, the conservative legacy media to kind of get their message out, get the story out, because there really was an attempt to speak directly to the Australian people, with the Uluru Statement from the heart. So people aren't just relying and don't need to just rely on, how things may or may not be reported in the Australian. The coverage around the Kumanjai Walker case, which was, of course, disgraceful in the Australian, but was also another example of that, where the family decided not to speak to particular media, instead engaged with Black media directly, and particular journalists that they chose to speak to, and decided that they didn't want to engage with particular outlets, kind of exercise their power to tell their own story in that way. So that's something that we're sort of examining and looking at. Hope that sort of answers the question.
Yeah, and I mean that last point I think is particularly important, and there's been a few questions come through that kind of touch on this, that the role that Black media in particular is playing in giving power back to Aboriginal people to speak to particular sources or particular outlets, to have more control over the narratives that they tell. I think that's been particularly true around coronial inquiries. I know we've got people listening in today who've been actively involved in the kind of live tweeting of inquests, and that sort of actual bypassing of the media that I think has been, is a really novel tool, a new tool in terms of holding conventional media to account. Much harder to spin if there's a direct narrative appearing. Is that something that you observed in the kind of historical study as well, that those other mechanisms for holding media to account in their reporting?
I think what we've found is that incredible range of strategies, tactics, approaches to try and communicate your aspirations to a kind of brick wall, so you've got this beautiful, lengthy petition, bark petitions, various efforts to charm a visiting prime minister. The efforts are endless. And then if you consider just the efforts, whether it's a petition, a bark petition, the sort of deeply thought out approach that came through the Uluru Statement, this very persuasive prose, this magnificent presentation, there's centrality of place, the hooking it up to other anniversaries. Just think about the tactics that underlie that, that effort to try and speak to a broader citizenry through the media. And the link, the failure in that chain is the translation of the media to adequately comprehend the real effort that is, and the real the language and the aspirations that underpin those highly crafted moments.
So this is maybe a bit of a crude question, but how do you explain that lack of, or that failure to comprehend? I mean, let's assume that most journalists aren't idiots. Maybe that's generous, I'm not sure, so apologies to any journalists tuning in today. But is this willful? Is this ideological? Is this, I mean, there's lots of questions in the chat about coming back to Murdoch and the kind of his mass media ownership, but also the role of the Australian in all of this. I mean, how much of this is editorial control, ideologically driven, or how much of it is just ignorance and misunderstanding on the part of journalists, do you think?
I think I would say, I'll give you a chance, Archie, it's probably a multiple of factors. And, I think one of the things that I was left thinking about is quite often we think about media in terms of representation. We rarely consider the role of the media in upholding the particular distribution of resources. So, we think more critical about, it's not just political power, it's not just the security of the sovereignty of the state and the security of the place of settler peoples, but it's also the security of the economic order. So that might take us down a sort of a sort of wild sort of Marxist path. But, you know, I think that those issues of political and economic and cultural power, if you like, they have to be taken into account. So the sort of aspirations that underpin, you know, whether it's the Uluru Statement, those the various petitions are about the rightful place of First Peoples within the life of the nation. And that is a very, you know, some people find that very disruptive, and that's a very threatening future. You know, I think what the Uluru Statement suggests is actually that's a really much more useful, fruitful and productive future rather than a threat. So I guess it's that the media really reports from the perspective of dominant society interests. And if you're reporting from dominant society interests, then you are always going to be an outlier within those dynamics. So I guess the task is to think about how our Aboriginal world's no longer outlier status, you know, outlier aspirations, and actually part of the story of the nation.
Yeah, I've been waiting here in Victoria for the media backlash, the Andrew Bolt and others, to respond to treaty. It's been remarkably quiet on the kind of right of the media to date. And I have a lot of conversations around this, the sense of kind of bated breath with which we're waiting to see, you know, will it be this election where the right-wing media decides to make treaty an election issue, which would really change the tone of the conversation and what's happening here. I can't explain the silence. It seems miraculous, but I think the next couple of months will be interesting. We have a lot of questions here that we're not going to get to, but we will share those with you in full when we finish. But just to give you the chance to wrap up, and a couple of people have asked again about the book, so an opportunity for you to plug it. Specifically, a question about the 4 narratives, if you just want to cover those off again briefly. And yes, plug the book. Available now at all good bookstores, but a lot of interest.
Yeah, available now. Yeah, so this is the book. Printed by Aboriginal Studies Press. Recommend buying it directly from their website and supporting IATSIS by doing so. So point about the 4 major narratives. Well, there were 3 major narratives and 1 minor narrative. And these were, you know, when we pulled together all of the case studies that we looked at over time, there was 11 of those, and the large amount of media coverage, and we looked at the narratives across all of them. We kind of summarized it into these 3 things. So we found what we called a white mastery narrative, which is really the basic racist, you know, settler assumption that Aboriginal society has been superseded by, you know, white society and settler interests, and that Aboriginal people's demands should always be considered in that kind of framework, you know, dismissed as irrelevant or, you know, derided. Then we found what we call the subordination narrative, and you see this appear a lot around kind of discourses of closing the gap. Plenty of research around the Northern Territory intervention. You'll find similar findings, I think, that says that to the extent that repressing Aboriginal rights helps in achieving Aboriginal socioeconomic equality, it's okay. And I'm sort of giving you, you know, a very you know, crude summary of these, but that's what we call the subordination narrative, where Aboriginal interests are subordinated to, you know, socioeconomic concerns, which are sort of elevated above all. And then we found what we called the reconciliation narrative, which, you know, recognizes, you know, the sort of trials and tribulations, you know, faced by Aboriginal people over time, is often quite emotive, you know, features a lot of, you know, kind of a sympathetic coverage of Aboriginal people and their interests, but largely sees the kind of cause as be problematic or, you know, hopeless, the idea that these reforms aren't going to succeed. So what we call the politics of procrastination, where the media says, wouldn't it be great if we could solve these problems? And if, you know, Australian people would, you know, vote yes for Indigenous rights in a referendum, without taking responsibility in a way for their role in that long history of, you know, procrastination and failure in reform. Then, as Heidi spoke about, there was the sovereignty nationhood narrative, which essentially recognises Aboriginal demands for self-determination, treaty, nationhood as legitimate, Aboriginal people as a legitimate negotiating partner with the Australian state, whose demands and interests and narratives need to be taken seriously, and just as seriously as those of the government and the rest of the Australian state. And we found that only really with the coverage of the Aboriginal Treaty Committee and in Indigenous media.
Terrific.
Anything you wanted to add?
That takes us exactly to time. So thank you so much for being consummate professionals. Thank you both for sharing that work. I can see from the Q&A lots and lots of interest in the book. So hopefully there'll be other opportunities for you to be speaking about it publicly, and a few people will go away and buy it after today. But thank you so much for contributing to the Critical Public Conversations series. Our theme this year is, of course, Undoing Australia. And I would suggest that undoing Australian media is a key part of how we might start changing some of the ways we think about the Australian nation. So thank you both very much. Amazing work. Goodbye, everyone. Please join us for the next Critical Public Conversations. See you.